Namaste, welcome to the Advaita channel. I'm going to be reading from The Transparency of Things by Rupert Spira. Just had to turn the sound off from the live YouTube window. Otherwise you can hear me speaking twice. Okay. So yes, welcome. I'm happy to be here reading from The Transparency of Things. So I read through each section and come to natural break, have some silence, and then read again. Sadhguru Muji Ji Ki Jai. Sadhguru Ananta Ji Ki Jai. So I'd started reading from the section called The Ease of Being. So I'm a little way through that section. If you want to comment, you can. You need to be signed into YouTube to be able to comment. And you're most welcome to. Returning to the identification of consciousness with a fragment, there is a big difference between I am not the body and I am not only the body. I am not the body is true in that it suggests that I, consciousness, am not the body if, by body, we mean an object that is outside and separate from consciousness. However, once it has been understood that all objects are like waves within consciousness, that consciousness takes the shape of every appearance, then I, consciousness, am the body. When the body is present, it is consciousness itself that is taking the shape of the body. However, in this case, it is still true that I, consciousness, am not only the body. I am also the world and everything else that is appearing in that moment. I am the totality of whatever is appearing within me, but I am also more than that, just as the ocean is more than the sum total of the waves. When no objects are present, consciousness is naturally one with itself. When objects are present, consciousness is naturally one with whatever is present. An object is limited when it is understood to be separate and independent of consciousness, but it is infinite when understood to be an expression of consciousness itself. Consciousness learns to identify exclusively with one part of the totality of whatever appears within itself, that is, with a body-mind. It chooses this identification out of its own innate freedom. In that sense, it is also natural. Ignorance is a choice that consciousness makes out of its own freedom. However, this exclusive identification is not something that is chosen once and for all. It is something that we, consciousness, choose from moment to moment. By the same token, consciousness is free to disidentify itself from the body-mind whenever it chooses. Some spiritual traditions emphasize the efforts that are required by consciousness to identify itself from the body-mind. But in fact, consciousness disidentifies itself effortlessly many times every day. This disidentification takes place quite naturally and effortlessly every time we fall asleep and in the intervals between perceptions. Consciousness also disidentifies itself from the body-mind every time a desire is fulfilled. Deep sleep is another example of the disidentification of consciousness from the body-mind. In fact, the peace and happiness that we experience in deep sleep is exactly the same peace and happiness that we feel on the fulfillment of a desire, or rather on the cessation of agitation that attends the fulfillment of a desire. Consciousness, happiness, or peace is like an underground river that bubbles up to the surface between the objects of the body, mind, and world. It is natural. It is a natural and familiar experience that is present in deep sleep and that is revealed on the cessation of a desire during a moment of love, humour, or beauty, and on many other occasions. From the point of view of the mind, these moments last for a period of time. They are considered to be caused by the objects that preceded them and to affect those that follow. They are seen to arise fleetingly to punctuate the seemingly continuous appearance of the body, mind, and world. However, from the point of view of consciousness, it is itself the continuous presence out of which the fleeting appearances of the body, mind, and world bubble up from time to time, and is itself their cause. These moments in between the appearance of objects are in fact timeless. They are neither linked together nor separated by time or space. Happiness is not a fleeting appearance in the permanent substratum of time and space. Rather, time and space are fleeting appearances within the permanent substratum of timeless, spaceless presence. Deep sleep is simply another name for this timeless, spaceless presence. Like happiness, it is causeless. Falling asleep is the most effortless thing. In fact, it is impossible to make an effort to fall asleep. It is the cessation of a previous effort that allows deep sleep. Exactly the same is true of consciousness. The natural state is not to be exclusively identified with anything. It requires an effort to identify consciousness exclusively with the body or the mind. However, we have become so accustomed to this exclusive identification of ourself, consciousness, with a body-mind, that we are, in most cases, not even aware of the subtle effort that this identification requires. For this reason, consciousness seems to have to make an effort to disidentify itself, but in doing so, it simply becomes aware of the previously undetected effort that it was making in order to identify itself exclusively with a body-mind. This exclusive identification may be natural, but it is not essential. Nothing imposes this exclusivity on consciousness. Nothing compels it. The state of identification with a single body-mind is part of consciousness repertoire, but it is not its original condition or its only possibility. Consciousness is freedom, and amongst the freedoms at its disposal is the freedom to identify or disidentify itself. Its natural condition is free from exclusive identification, but it is free to identify itself exclusively with the body-mind in order to enjoy and suffer what that has to offer. Once consciousness has identified itself exclusively with a body-mind, it seems to bind itself, and as a result, many of the subsequent experiences that appear within it seem to corroborate its new identity. Finding itself apparently limited to a body-mind, it enjoys and suffers the inevitable consequences of being a fragment in a vast universe. For some time, it tries to manipulate its experience in order to yield happiness, without yet understanding that happiness and the separate entity are mutually exclusive positions. However, after some time of playing the game of being a separate entity, consciousness begins to tire. It longs for something more substantial than the fleeting and precarious moments of happiness that seem to be at the mercy of innumerable causes that are apparently outside its control. Having exhausted the conventional possibilities of securing happiness, consciousness, pretending to be a separate entity, searches in other, less familiar territory. One version of this is the spiritual search. However, sooner or later, gradually or instantaneously, consciousness comes to recognize that it is already precisely what it is looking for, and that it is the search itself that prevents this realization. This self-recognition is not caused by anything that takes place within the search itself, because the self-recognition is precisely the recognition that consciousness is happiness, fulfillment, or peace itself, and that this fulfillment is always and already prior to and within every experience. This understanding is synonymous with the total collapse of the search, which may, however, reappear from time to time due to the inertia of habit. Namaste, Nikhil. Hope I pronounced your name right, Nikhil. Stefan for you. Thanks for joining. Consciousness is free to withdraw its exclusive identification with the body-mind whenever it pleases. We forget that as an infant, we gradually learnt to identify ourselves, consciousness, with successive levels of the body and the mind. In most cases, the withdrawal of this identification happens in reverse order, in a series of stages, starting with the most obvious layers of identification with the body and the mind, and continuing to the deepest layers. We are like a deep well, and the presence of intelligence, love, and beauty in our lives is like the appearance of the sun at midday, shining directly into the well. Normally, only the creatures living at the surface of the well are active, due to the lack of light lower down. However, for a short period each day, the creatures living at deeper levels wake up due to the presence of the sun shining directly above them. Such is the presence of intelligence in our lives. As the sun of intelligence, love, and beauty comes more frequently over the well, So deeper and deeper layers of identification come into the light and are revealed. In this way, consciousness sees its identification with successive layers of the body-mind and clearly understands how it limits itself in this way. This understanding brings about a natural relaxation of this identification. Every time it relaxes this identification, it is, without knowing it, to begin with, remembering itself, returning to itself. Consciousness never really returns to itself. It just abides knowingly in and as itself. It no longer other than it is. To begin with, it is not accustomed to this abidance within itself, and it grasps again for the old objects, the old habits of avoidance and resistance with which it has become familiar and comfortable. However, over and over again, this identification with layers of the body-mind is relaxed through understanding, and consciousness becomes increasingly comfortable abiding in and as itself. The ease of being begins to pervade experience. From time to time, old layers of identification with the body-mind reappear. However, they lose their separating power, and with it their capacity to induce suffering. Those that are necessary for the functioning of everyday life continue as and when they are needed. Those that are not functional drop away naturally, and more we find ourselves in our natural condition. This is not an extraordinary state. It is simple and natural, and may even dawn on us without the mind being aware of anything special. In place of the subtle sense of lack that pervaded our thoughts, feelings, and activities in the past, a sense of well-being and ease begins to shine in the background of our lives and to overflow into the foreground of our activities and relationships. The experience of love is precisely this relaxation of consciousness, exclusive identification with a separate body-mind, and as a result, the inevitable inclusion of the other, of all others within itself. For that reason, love is said and felt to be unconditional, uncaused, unmodified, universal. It has no opposite. It is inherent in our true nature. Imagine a king who has enjoyed life in his palace. One day he wishes to experience the life of one of his subjects, and so he instructs his ministers to treat him as a normal person until he commands them otherwise. On the next day, the king goes out into the marketplace disguised as a peasant, and although his ministers are watching from a distance, they are powerless to intervene. To begin with, the king does not notice that the enjoyment he feels in the marketplace is of the same nature as the enjoyment he feels in the palace. So he soon forgets that he is pretending. Presently he begins to suffer, and having forgotten his birthright, tries all sorts of strategies within the marketplace in order to alleviate it. However, nothing that is on offer can remind him or return him to his palace. Seeing his plight and feeling powerless to help, the ministers dress up as ordinary men. From time to time, the king encounters one of his disguised ministers, and without betraying their promise to treat him as a normal person, they indicate to him that he is not what he thinks and feels himself to be. Due to the depth of his amnesia, the king takes some time, but sooner or later he remembers who he really is and returns to the palace, ordering the ministers to resume their official duties. At the very moment the king abdicated his royal powers, he gave up his freedom of his own free will. His freedom expressed itself as the desire not to be free. From that moment on, he seemed to be bound, and the circumstances of his life seemed to confirm his new status. In this state, the only freedom available to the king pretending to be an ordinary person is the freedom to remember himself again as he truly is. It is only when the king reclaims his royal identity that he realizes that although he thought, felt, and behaved as though he were bound, in fact he was always free. He realizes that his status as an ordinary person was self-imposed and imaginary, and that even when he was deeply involved with the traumas of being an ordinary person, he was nevertheless always the king. There was nothing that could be done, or more importantly, that needed to be done to reclaim his birthright, other than simply to recognize it and to start behaving accordingly. As the peasant, the king had no freedom other than to remember his true identity. As the king, he always had complete freedom. Once consciousness has chosen, out of its own inherent freedom, to identify itself with a fragment, the only freedom available to it is to disidentify itself from that fragment, to know itself again as it always is. It is for this reason that the statements, "you have no freedom" and "you have complete freedom" are both true from different points of view. knowingness. The nature of consciousness is knowing or knowingness. It is the knowing of what is known, the experiencing of what is experienced, the perceiving of what is perceived. When consciousness knows anything, it knows itself. Consciousness is the knowingness in every experience, and therefore it knows itself in every experience simply because it is itself. Consciousness is the knowing of itself. Consciousness does not have to do anything to know itself. Its being itself is its knowing itself. It always knows itself. The sun's nature is to illumine. Therefore, by its nature, it illumines itself. Illumination is what it is, not what it does. It does not need to illuminate itself, because by definition, it is always illumined. It is self-luminous. Likewise, consciousness is self-luminous. It is the light with which it sees itself. Knowing is what consciousness is, not what it does. Knowingness is the nature of consciousness. Therefore, it knows itself in the knowing of anything. In the knowing of any object, this knowing consciousness is present, and as knowing is its nature, its presence is the knowing of itself. Knowing and being are identical in consciousness. It does not have to know something in order to know itself. Its knowing of anything is its knowing of itself. And when no object is present, this knowing remains exactly as it always is, knowing only itself. Consciousness cannot not know itself. When this is clearly seen, consciousness stops looking for itself outside itself, because it is deeply understood that it is experiencing itself in every experience that occurs. When no objectivity is present, for instance in deep sleep or in the interval between thoughts or perceptions, consciousness being itself is its knowing itself. However, as no objective content is present in this experience, there is nothing to be remembered there. Nothing objective is experienced, so the mind, which comprises only objects, cannot lay claim to this experience. It was not present during it. There was no mind and therefore nothing to be remembered. As it reappears, the mind interprets this experience of the timeless presence of consciousness as a blank, a void, because all it can know are objects. It would be more accurate to say that consciousness represents this experience of its own formless presence as a blank object in the mind. However, even a blank or a void is a subtle object. As soon as this experience of the formless presence of consciousness is represented in the mind, it takes a form, because mind is form. Therefore, the most accurate representation in the mind of the formless presence of consciousness is a blank object, a void. It is, so to speak, a form without a form. It is a representation which tries to impersonate the formless presence of consciousness. It is the best the mind can do, but it is misleading because by attempting to represent itself in the mind in this way, consciousness commits itself to seeking for itself within the realm of objectivity. In this way, consciousness is seduced by its own creativity. It creates this blank state as an impersonation of itself, and then interprets that state as an absence of itself. In so doing, it believes its own creation of a blank object. It buys the "I am not present" theory, which consciousness itself creates in the mind. In short, consciousness forgets itself. As a consequence of buying the blank object theory in this way, the "I am not present" theory, consciousness is condemned to looking for itself within the realm of objects. This is the moment when the prodigal son leaves the palace. He turns away from the father towards the world of objects. Consciousness apparently turns away from itself and looks outward towards the realm of mind. In fact, the experience of consciousness knowing itself is always taking place. It is taking place in the absence of objectivity and in the presence of objectivity. That is why it is not quite true to say that consciousness forgets itself. It would be more accurate to say that it pretends to forget itself. The prodigal son leaves the palace, but he does not yet know that he never leaves the kingdom. Therefore, because the experience of consciousness knowing itself is colourless and transparent, because it cannot be experienced as an object, consciousness overlooks its own presence. It forgets that it is always it forgets that it is always already experiencing itself, and so it looks for itself outside, apparently outside, in the realm of objectivity. In that moment, consciousness throws a veil over itself. It forgets itself, and the search for itself begins. Every now and then, the search is brought to an end in a moment of understanding, love, or beauty. In such moments, consciousness experiences itself knowingly. Consciousness is reminded of itself. Consciousness reminds itself of itself. It tastes itself. It's so lovely to be here with you and share in this clear, simple pointing. To know that this knowing, by the fact that anything is known, this knowing is present, and there's no need to go looking for it. It's self-evident, it's already here. And all these ripples of thoughts and emotions the only expressions of this one substance that is awareness, that is this consciousness that we are. So grateful and happy to be sharing in this truth, in this reading for the Advaita channel. Thank you for joining. Thank you. Thank you. And hope to share some more next week for the Advaita channel. Sadhguru Mujijiki, Jai. Sadhguru Anantajiki, Jai. Sangha Ji Ki Jai.